They asked why humans don't have a deity of war. We slayed ours for being too soft. The translator in my ear was already 3 seconds behind, and Suthan's long silver fingers had stopped moving the moment I opened my mouth. That was how I knew I had the room. I had not planned to say it like that. I had prepared a careful answer, something polished and diplomatic, the kind of response that slides off the mind without leaving a mark. I had practiced it in my quarters the night before, standing in front of a small mirror bolted to the wall, speaking to my own reflection in the particular calm, even voice that the diplomatic corps trains you to use when you are saying something that could go badly wrong. It was a good answer. It was a safe answer. It was the kind of answer that passes through a room without disturbing anything, and gets recorded in the registry and moves on. I did not give that answer. The Velkari ambassador, Suthan, had looked at me with those wide silver eyes and asked the question with the tone of someone who already knew the answer was coming. He had already asked 41 other species the same question. He had 41 answers in his recording crystal, each one a name, a description, a history. He had tilted his head slightly to the right, which his people do when they are being gracious, and he had asked with complete sincerity, as if the answer were obvious, as if every civilization that had ever reached the stars must have one. And which deity governs your conduct in war? I am Marin Voss. I am 38 years old. I have been a xenolinguist and cultural attaché for the Earth Diplomatic Corps for 11 years, long enough that I have learned to read silence the way other people read text. I speak 14 alien languages fluently and 4 more passably, and I have sat across from beings who could move faster than I could track, beings who communicated entirely through color, beings who experienced time differently enough from me that a normal conversation required careful scheduling just to make sure we were discussing the same moment. I have, in my professional life, handled situations that most humans on Earth would consider extraordinary, and that I consider, at this point, a typical Tuesday. I had never, in 11 years of service, been asked a question that stopped me so completely cold. Which deity governs your conduct in war? The Hall of 10,000 Lights on Orison 7 was everything its name suggested. The station floated at the edge of a blue dwarf star, a celestial body that burned with a cold, ancient light, quite different from the warm yellow sun of Earth, and the station's designers had oriented the Great Hall so that the star was always visible through the curved far wall, a constant presence, a reminder that the conversations happening inside were taking place against the scale of the cosmos, not just the scale of politics. Every surface in the hall was carved, not decorated, carved, deeply and deliberately, with the names of gods in 200 languages, war gods and harvest gods, and gods of the sea and the sky, and the dark space between stars. The conclave of civilizations had built this place as a monument to what civilizations believed, what they feared, what they loved enough to make sacred. It was, genuinely, one of the most beautiful spaces I had ever been in. I had been sitting in it for 3 days. The conclave's mythology summit was held once every 40 years, which by human standards is a long gap, and by some of the species in that room is barely a moment. The purpose was to update the Pantheon Registry, the galaxy's most comprehensive record of active and historical religious traditions. Every member species sent a cultural representative to speak to their beliefs, their stories, their sense of the divine. It was, in theory, a purely academic exercise. In practice, it was the kind of gathering where you could learn more about a civilization in 6 hours than you could from 20 years of diplomatic briefings, because what people believe at the level of the sacred is a more honest picture of who they are than anything they choose to present at a negotiating table. For 3 days I had watched species after species stand up and offer their mythology to the record, and every single one of them had filled me with a particular feeling that I was still trying to name when Suthan turned to me. The Charathi had presented a war deity named Vreth, who required that all conflicts begin with 7 days of enforced silence, a pause built into the divine laws themselves, a cooling period during which neither side could act. The idea was that most conflicts, given 7 days of quiet, would resolve themselves or at least reduce in scale before the fighting began. The Moreni delegate, Orel, had described twin war gods who could only authorize conflict if both sides of a dispute invoked them simultaneously, which made unilateral aggression literally impossible within the Moreni faith. a divine structure that functioned like a lock requiring two keys. The Quellish had a goddess who was said to appear on every battlefield and weep for every person who fell, her tears forming the rivers that kept her homeworld green, a mythology that turned the cost of war into something literally visible in the landscape every single day. The Yetharali had a war deity who could not appear until every peaceful option had been formally exhausted and witnessed by 3 neutral observers. Every war god in that hall was a leash, a beautiful, carefully designed, culturally specific leash, meant to make war something a civilization could survive without losing what made it worth surviving. I had sat for 3 days listening to the most thoughtful, compassionate, sophisticated systems of divine constraint on violence that I had ever encountered, and I had felt, growing quietly in the back of my mind, a specific kind of pride in the species that had produced all of these things. And then they came to me. Suthan had his recording crystal raised. Around the curved table, 41 species looked in my direction with expressions I had learned, over 3 days, to read. Mild interest from the Charathi, deep reverence from the Velkari, for whom this registry was a sacred act in itself, careful academic attention from the Yetharali, who treated information the way some beings treated food. This was a ceremony to them, a sharing of what was most essentially true about a civilization. I set down my water glass. "We had one," I said. The translator caught up with a half-second delay. Suthan's fingers slowed. Around the table, the particular quality of the room's attention shifted in a way I felt more than heard. "We built him a very long time ago," I continued. "Out of everything we had, out of the fear of dying, and the courage required to face that fear anyway, out of the need to believe that what we did to each other on our battlefields meant something more than just the outcome. He was tall in the stories. He carried fire in one hand, and mercy in the other. He had rules. He had laws. He was, by every measure I can think of, a reasonable and moral deity." The Chorathi observer, Quel Harith, leaned slightly forward. He was the oldest delegate in the room. You could tell not just by his appearance but by the economy of his movements, the way beings who have lived long enough stop spending energy on anything unnecessary. He had the look of someone who has just heard a familiar melody played in an unfamiliar key and is trying to decide whether the difference is a mistake or something intentional. "What was his name?" Suthan asked softly. "Kael Dorith," I said. "The humans of the southern lowlands called him the Spear That Remembers. The northern clans called him the Just Flame. Coastal peoples named him the Tide That Holds. Different names across thousands of languages, across every continent and island chain we inhabited, but the same presence underneath all of them. He arose when humanity was young enough to believe, we were not wrong to believe this, that war could be made holy if you approached it correctly, that violence could be given structure and meaning and moral weight, and that a divine presence could hold that structure in place, even when the humans involved were afraid, or angry, or exhausted, or desperate." I paused. Around the table, 41 species sat in a silence that had texture to it, the kind that forms when a large number of very attentive minds all recognize at the same moment that a story has taken a turn they did not expect. "He is not in the registry," Suthan said carefully, turning the crystal over in his fingers. "I compiled the records personally for this summit. We searched every surviving text from every human historical period. No deity named Kael Dorith appears in any active tradition." "No," I agreed. "He would not be in the registry. He is not in ours either. Not in any temple. Not in any living prayer. Not in any ceremony still practiced anywhere on Earth, or in any human settlement in the galaxy." I looked around the table. "We do not have an active deity of war because we no longer have that deity. We are not a species that forgot its gods through distraction, or outgrew them through reason alone, the way some civilizations drift away from belief as technology advances. We are a species that made a specific and deliberate decision about a specific god." "What decision?" Suthan asked, though I think he had already heard enough to know. "We decided he was not doing the job," I said. "He was too merciful. He was too concerned with the structure of how we fought, and not concerned enough with the outcome. He was, in a word that I suspect will translate awkwardly but which is the most accurate one I have." I paused. "He was too soft." The silence that followed those 2 words was of a completely different character from the silence that had preceded them. It was heavier, denser. The Moreni delegate made a sound that her translator rendered as a sharp intake of breath. The Quellish representative turned to their assistant and said something rapid and low. Suthan's recording crystal was still raised, but his hand had stopped moving entirely. Quell Harith spoke first. His voice was careful and measured in the way that very old beings with very long memories sometimes speak, as if each word is being weighed against everything else they have ever heard before being released. You said he had laws, rules. You said he was reasonable and moral. If that is true, if he governed your conduct in war with wisdom and mercy, why would your people decide that was insufficient? It was the question. The one I had known was coming from the moment I opened my mouth. I looked at the carved wall behind Suthan, at 10,000 divine names in 200 languages, not one of them the one I had just spoken, and I made a decision about how much to say, and in what order. Because mercy, in certain circumstances, becomes a form of surrender, I said. Not surrender to the enemy. Surrender to the idea that the rules matter more than the people the rules are supposed to protect. Kael Dorith was built for a world of smaller, bounded conflicts. He was not built for the world humanity eventually created, which was larger and more complicated, and more desperate than the one he had been designed for. And a God who cannot adapt, who cannot recognize that his laws have become a cage, is a God whose mercy is no longer mercy. It is just procedure. I picked up my water glass again, not to drink, but to have something to do with my hands while the words settled. I will tell you the whole of it, I said. Where he came from, what he was, what he asked of us, and for how long we gave it, and what happened the day a human general saved 40,000 lives by breaking every law Kael Dorith had written, and paid for it immediately, in front of his soldiers, in the moment of his greatest success. I set the glass down, because that story is the honest answer to your question. Not just who Kael Dorith was, but what kind of species you are sitting across from in this room right now. I sat back. No one moved toward the door. No one reached for their belongings, or their refreshments, or their private communication devices. Outside the great curved window, the blue dwarf star burned in its quiet, ancient way. He was ours, I said. The best thing we ever made, and we unmade him anyway. I looked around the table one more time, meeting as many of those 41 pairs of eyes as I could. You deserve to understand why, I began. He was not always called Kael Dorith. In the oldest layers of human history, the layers so deep that what we find there are not texts but impressions, not records but residue, the thing that would eventually become him appeared without a name. He was not a figure yet. He was a feeling, a weight that humans carried with them into danger, a sense that the act of raising a weapon against another person was observed by something beyond both of them, not judged necessarily, not punished or rewarded in any immediate visible way, just witnessed, seen, the sense that the cosmos was paying attention, which is perhaps the oldest religious instinct that exists, the sense from which everything else grows. Every human culture across every continent and island chain gave that feeling a name and a shape. The Romans called theirs Mars. The Norse called theirs Tyr, notably, a god of single combat and law, not simply violence. The Yoruba had Ogun, who governed both iron tools and iron weapons, who was the patron of surgeons and blacksmiths as much as warriors, a deity of the transformative power of metal, rather than violence alone. Every culture found a different angle on the same essential presence, and the angle they chose said something about what they were most afraid of, and what they most wanted to sanctify. Kael Dorith arose from the meeting of those angles. He was not a single culture's invention. He emerged during a period historians call the Age of the Compact, roughly 4,000 years ago by Earth reckoning, when human civilizations that had long existed in relative isolation from each other began to collide frequently enough that they needed a shared framework. Trade had expanded, populations had grown. The conflicts that arose were no longer between small groups with limited stakes, but between large, organized societies with everything to lose. And in that environment, the separate war god traditions of separate human cultures began to converge, not through any deliberate theological project, but the way rivers converge when they share a landscape. The conditions required it, and so it happened. Kael Dorith was tall in every version of the story, always tall, always radiant with some quality of light that varied by telling but was always present. He carried something in each hand, a weapon and an open palm, a spear and a spread hand, a sword and an outstretched arm, fire held in one fist and emptiness in the other. The specific objects changed. The image of capacity paired with restraint never did. The open palm was his signature. That detail was consistent across every culture that told his story. He could strike and he could stop. He had the authority to authorize violence and the authority to end it. He was not a god of war in the simple sense of being the divine representation of human capacity for harm. He was a god of bounded war, which is a much more specific and much more complicated thing to be. I described this to the delegates of the conclave, and I watched Suthan's body language shift as I spoke. The tension that had been visible in him since I said the words, "too soft," began to ease. He was, I could see, starting to build a picture of Kael Dorith that reassured him. A reasonable deity, a merciful one, a god who represented the best human impulses toward limiting the damage of conflict, rather than the worst impulses toward maximizing it. He was starting to think that perhaps he had misunderstood, that perhaps the story was going somewhere other than where it appeared to be going. He had not misunderstood. I let him have the comfort a little longer, because he would need it to contrast against what came next. Kael Dorith's laws, as recorded in the earliest surviving texts that mention him by name, were 14 in total. I did not recite all 14. We would have been in that hall until the star outside burned cold. But I described their shape and their intent, because the intent mattered as much as the content. No conflict without formal declaration, giving both sides the chance to step back from the edge. No weapons raised against those who could not raise them back. The non-combatant protections were explicit and specific. Healers on every side of any conflict were untouchable, sacred, protected by divine authority, regardless of which banner they served. Prisoners were to be given food, water, shelter, and basic dignity, until the conflict that produced them was resolved. Any commander who ordered violence against places where people slept, cooked, or raised families was personally answerable to Kael Dorith. Not in some distant afterlife reckoning, but immediately, visibly, in the field where the order had been given. They were, by any honest assessment, remarkable laws. "These are not unlike our own sacred boundaries," said Aurel, the Moreni delegate, who had been quiet and attentive through most of the summit. Her two war gods governed conflict through a system of mutual invocation. Both sides had to call on them simultaneously, and the result was a Moreni sphere that had not experienced large-scale unilateral aggression in living memory. She sounded genuinely moved. "These protections are serious. They are thoughtful. They represent the kind of divine governance that takes centuries to develop." "They do," I agreed. "And they worked. That is the important thing to understand before we get to the part where they stopped working. For a long time, a remarkably long time actually, they worked. Not perfectly, because no law, divine or otherwise, is ever followed perfectly, and humans are less capable of perfection in conflict than they are in any other area. But sufficiently, meaningfully, the concept of war changed under those laws. It became formal. It developed seasons and protocols and a specific cultural weight. It had ceremony. Enemy commanders could share a meal before a battle under the laws of Kael Dorith because the laws said that the person standing across the field from you was still a person, and the god was watching both of you with the same attention, and neither of you was permitted to forget it. Quelharith nodded once. He recognized this pattern. His own civilization had something similar, enforced by different means but producing comparable results. The elevation of war into a structured cultural practice, with rules everyone recognized and, at least nominally, followed. "And then," he said quietly, already knowing, "something changed." "The stakes grew," I said. "That is the simplest way to describe it. Kael Dorith's laws were designed for a world of clans and city-states fighting over river valleys and trade routes, and hereditary grievances that could, in principle, be satisfied. They were not designed for a world of empires, and humanity, being what we are, restless and ambitious and extremely good at building things larger than the last thing we built, eventually created empires. Not one, many, simultaneously, competing. And when the thing you are fighting for is not a field or a trade route, but the survival of your entire people, their language, their future, their children's ability to exist in the world, the laws of a Bronze Age deity begin to show their limits. He could not adapt? Asked Lena, the Yetharali delegate. He could not, I said. That was his nature. He was a god of a specific kind of peace, the structured, ceremonial peace of bounded conflict, and he was made with the assumption that the conflicts humanity engaged in would remain bounded. When they stopped being bounded, he did not change with them. He continued to enforce his 14 laws in an environment that had outgrown them, which is a bit like trying to govern an ocean with a set of rules written for a pond. I picked up the water glass and held it, not drinking, just holding. The fray began about 2,000 years before the incident at Aerith Vale, I continued. Not a sudden collapse, but a slow and painful stretching. Civilizations that were fighting for survival found that following Kael Dorith's mercy laws against an enemy who was not following them was a form of choosing to lose. And losing, when what you were losing was everything, not a trade argument, not a territorial dispute, but the continued existence of your people, was not a moral option. It was an extinction, and Kael Dorith, bound to his own nature, continued to demand the laws be followed regardless. And your people followed them, said Suthan. It was not quite a question. Some did, some did not, and the ones who did not, when they survived because they had not, and the ones who did, when they sometimes died because they had, the balance began to shift, not in theology but in practice. In the quiet, private calculations of commanders who prayed to Kael Dorith in the morning, and then made decisions in the afternoon that they knew he would not approve of, because survival required it. I looked at the wall of carved names. My eyes moved across them slowly, finding the absence I was looking for, the space where one particular name should have been and was not. There was a general, I said. His name was Aldrich. He commanded the forces defending a city called Aerith Vale, which sat at the center of a river delta that controlled sea access for 6 separate regions. Aerith Vale was not simply a city. It was the economic heart of an entire civilization. Its people were not primarily soldiers. They were craftspeople and traders and scholars and farmers who had the misfortune of living in a place that 2 great powers both needed to control. If the city fell to the enemy advancing on it, the people inside and the regions depending on it did not merely lose a battle, they lost everything. The room was very quiet. Aldrich had been following the laws of Kael Dorith his entire military life, I said. He was, by all surviving accounts, a genuinely devout man, not performatively devout, actually devout, in the way that shapes how a person thinks and makes decisions at the level where it is invisible from the outside. He believed in the open palm. He had trained his soldiers in the 14 laws and enforced them when other commanders would not have. He had, more than once, suffered tactical disadvantage because of his commitment to those laws, and he had accepted that disadvantage as the cost of being the kind of commander he wanted to be. I paused. The enemy advancing on Aerith Vale had already taken 3 cities in the Delta region. In none of those 3 cities had they followed the sacred boundaries. They had moved without declaration. They had not separated the healers. They had not provided for their prisoners. They had, in 3 sequential engagements, ignored every law Kael Dorith had written and won each time, because moving without ceremony is faster than moving with it, and speed in certain kinds of conflict is everything. The amber eyes of Quelhareth were fixed on me. He had closed the small distance between leaning back and leaning forward, and he was watching my face the way someone watches a fire that is moving toward something important. Aldrich sat with his senior commanders for 3 days, I said. Not planning tactics. He already knew the tactics. Debating the question, whether a man bound by sacred law could set aside those laws to save the people those laws were meant to protect, whether mercy, applied unilaterally, in a situation where the other side had already abandoned mercy, was still a virtue, or whether it had become something else, whether a general who followed the rules while his enemy ignored them was being faithful to his God, or was simply choosing a beautiful way to fail. On the 4th day, he moved, without declaration, without ceremony. He made choices that violated every one of Kael Dorith's 14 laws, not out of cruelty, but out of the cold, clear understanding that following those laws in that situation would cost him the battle, and losing that battle would cost 40,000 people everything they had. He chose speed over ritual. He chose decisive action over the formal structures that Kael Dorath required. He chose the people over the procedures. And he won, said Quell Harith, flatly, already knowing. He won, I confirmed. The city stood. The 40,000 people inside it, craftspeople and traders and scholars and the children of all of them, survived. The enemy withdrew. By any practical measure, by the measure of outcomes rather than procedure, Aldrich had done the correct thing. I looked around the table. Kael Dorath appeared on the field the moment the battle ended. This is consistent across every version of the story, in every culture that recorded it. He appeared, and he reviewed what Aldrich had done against his 14 laws, and he found it wanting. And Aldrich, the man who had just saved 40,000 lives by choosing them over the ceremony, died in the moment of his greatest success, in front of the soldiers who had fought beside him, struck down by the god he had served his entire life. No one in the hall spoke. His soldiers watched it happen, I said. They were standing in the city they had saved, surrounded by the people they had chosen to protect over the rules, and they watched their general die for making that choice. And they did not pray harder. They did not repent. They did not decide that the next time they would follow the laws more carefully, even if it cost them the battle. I looked at Suthan. They looked at each other, and they made a decision. Not that day. Decisions that large and that permanent take longer than a day to complete. But the seed of it was planted in that moment, on that field, over Aldrich's body. What was the decision? Suthan asked, very softly. That a god who kills the man who saves the innocent, in order to enforce the laws designed to protect the innocent, is a god who has confused his own laws for his purpose, I said. That the rules had become more important to him than the people the rules were written for, and that a god in that condition cannot be reformed, because his nature is fixed. He can only be removed. The silence stretched so long that the ventilation system of the station became audible again. That low, constant hum you stop hearing after a few hours, and only notice in the spaces between large things. I looked at Suthan's recording crystal, still held loosely in his silver fingers. I looked at the wall of carved names. I looked at the 41 pairs of eyes around the table, all of them carrying versions of the same expression, the specific expression of a mind that has just received information it was not prepared for and is in the process of deciding what to do with it. He was not destroyed that day, I said. A god is not ended in a moment. He lasted another 2,000 years after Areth Vale. He did not last well. I looked at my hands. But that story, the end of him, I will tell you later, because first you need to understand what humanity built in the space he left behind, because that is the part that will concern you most. I reached for my water glass. Outside the great curved window, the blue dwarf star burned in its old, patient way. When Kael Dorath began to fade, I said, we did not stop fighting. I want to be very clear about that, because I think the natural assumption is that removing a war god would either end conflict or make it completely ungoverned and therefore total. Neither of those things happened. What happened was something stranger and, depending on your perspective, considerably more unsettling. Suthan had set down his recording crystal. He was no longer in the posture of an official taking a formal account. He was sitting forward, elbows on the table, in the posture of a person who has forgotten their role because they are simply listening. I waited a moment to make sure I had all of them. Then I said, what happened was that humanity started writing its own rules. A memory from my years of training at the diplomatic corps comes to me sometimes, not from a lecture or a briefing, but from a hallway, which is where the real education tends to happen. I was 25 years old and between sessions at the academy on Luna, walking a long white corridor with my principal instructor, a woman named Dr. Celia Marsh who had been in first contact work for 30 years and had the particular stillness of someone whose threshold for surprise has been significantly recalibrated by experience. We were discussing a world called Hellwrath 4, where two species had been in active conflict for approximately 200 years, with no apparent resolution in sight. I had asked what I thought was a simple question. Why hadn't anyone won yet? Dr. Marsh had looked at me for a moment, then said, their war god permits combat but forbids decisive victory. The conflict is sacred, which means it is also perpetual. Both sides believe the god requires the war to continue. It functions as a form of collective prayer. So 200 years, no winner, no resolution, just continuation, because their deity has made continuation the holiest available action. I had thought about that conversation many times in the years since. Sitting in the Hall of 10,000 Lights on Orison 7, watching Quell Harith of the Karathi listen to the story of Kael Dorath with those patient amber eyes, I thought about it again. His people had been in a ceremonial war for 600 years, held in sacred stalemate by a deity who required balance in every engagement. 600 years of people dying in managed, holy, ritually bounded increments that never resolved anything, because resolution was not the point. The point was the continuation of the sacred pattern. The first thing humanity produced after Kael Dorath began to fade, I said, was philosophy. Not religion, philosophy. Books written by people who had lived through conflicts and survived them and then sat down, while they could still remember clearly, and asked, what was that for? And how do we make sure that the next time it happens, it accomplishes something? A man named Sun Tzu, I said, wrote a short text on strategy, approximately 500 years after Kael Dorath began his decline. 13 chapters, not long. He did not write about the will of any god. He did not write about the sacred obligations of the warrior, or the divine approval required before blades could be drawn. He wrote about victory as a function of information, positioning, timing, and the honest assessment of your own weaknesses. He described conflict not as a holy act performed in service to a deity, but as a system, something with inputs and outputs that could be studied, modeled, and optimized. That book is still taught in military academies on Earth, I said. It is over 2,000 years old. One book, Suthan said, by one man. The first of many, I agreed. After that came centuries more. Strategists who built on strategists, and then philosophers who stepped back from the tactical questions entirely and asked the larger ones. Not how to win a specific conflict, but what conflict is for, what a civilization owes to itself and to others in the conduct of war, whether the means can ever be separated from the ends, and if not, what that means for the choices made in the field. Aurel leaned forward slightly. Without a divine authority to provide answers, the answers became human answers, I said, which is exactly as complicated as it sounds. A divine law is fixed. It does not change based on context, does not require re-evaluation, does not need a committee. A human law, a philosophical principle, a strategic doctrine, is alive. It changes when the situation changes. It requires people to actually think, every time, about whether what they are doing is justified by what they are trying to achieve. Unquote. I paused. That is harder. Much harder. But it produced something that Kael Dorath's fixed laws could not produce, which was adaptability, the capacity to learn from each conflict what the next one required. But adaptability in war. Aurel paused. She was choosing her words carefully. Adaptability in war can be a path to greater harm as easily as lesser. A system that optimizes for winning rather than for following sacred limits is a system that will find new ways to cause damage. Yes, I said simply. And we did. There were periods in human history after Kael Dorath's decline that were catastrophic by any measure. Conflicts that covered entire continents. Technologies applied to war that multiplied its destructive capacity in ways that no deity, had one been present, could have sanctioned. The 19th and 20th centuries of Earth's Common Era produced conflicts that killed more people in shorter periods than anything Kael Dorath's wars had ever approached. I met her eyes. I am not here to tell you that what replaced the god was better in every way. I am here to tell you what it was. The room waited. It was ours, I said. The failures were ours. The successes were ours. When we fought in ways that could not be justified, there was no divine authority to blame and no divine forgiveness available. When we developed laws of war, international treaties, conventions on the treatment of prisoners, rules governing the use of certain weapons, those laws were written by humans who had survived the consequences of not having them, and they were enforced by humans who understood what was at stake if they lapsed. They were imperfect, they were violated, but they were also updated, because they were human laws, and human laws can be updated. Kael Dorath's could not. Who decides when they have been violated? Asked Lena. Without a god to impose the consequence? We do, I said. through international bodies, through treaty mechanisms, through the pressure that civilized nations apply to each other, when one of them crosses the lines they have all agreed upon. It is messy. It is slow. It does not always work. I looked at her directly. But it is based on consequence rather than ritual. The question is never whether the correct ceremony was performed. The question is whether the outcome was worth the cost, whether the harm caused was proportionate to the harm prevented, whether the people making the decisions can justify them to the people who will live with the results. That, said Lena quietly, is a very heavy thing to carry. Yes, I agreed, it is. Quelhareth had been very still for a long time, the stillness of a being who is doing significant thinking. He spoke now, slowly. You mentioned a concept. Earlier you called it deterrence. Your word, your translator rendered it as a promise of consequence. The promise of complete consequence, I said. Deterrence is the philosophical and strategic framework that humanity developed as the closest thing we have to what a war deity used to provide. A reason not to start a conflict in the first place. Not the moral reason that Kael Doreth provided. Not the divine prohibition, but a practical, mathematical reason. The understanding, made as clear and as certain as possible, that beginning a conflict with us will cost more than can be recovered. That we will finish what we did not start, completely and without the limitations that ceremony imposes. That we are not fighting for the honor of a god who requires balanced exchanges. We are fighting for survival, and survival has no ceiling. The silence was very deep. You replaced your war god, Suthan said slowly, with the promise of what you would do if someone made war on you. With the promise, I said, and the demonstrated capacity. A promise without capacity is a wish. We made sure, over time, that it was not a wish. Quelhareth closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he looked at me with an expression I could not entirely read. It contained grief, but also something that might have been recognition. My people have been at war for 600 years, he said, very quietly. Not for the room, for me. The deity governing it requires balance. Every engagement must be matched. No single battle can be allowed to be decisive. We have lost, he stopped, many people, over 600 years, because the god requires the war to continue. I looked at him. I did not look away. I know, I said. Is there? He stopped again, assembled the words. Is there a way to end something like that, without losing what was built around it, without the people understanding it as a collapse of everything they have believed? It was not a general question. It was a specific one. I understood that. That, I said carefully, is a conversation I would like to have with you privately, if you are willing. He nodded, once. We sat in the hall for a while longer. I finished what I had to say about deterrence and doctrine, and the cold, practical theology of consequence that humanity had built in the centuries since Kael Doreth faded. The other delegates listened. Some of them asked questions. Oral was thoughtful and precise. Lena was troubled in a way that was honest rather than hostile. Suthan sat with his recording crystal in his lap and said very little. And then I said that I had one more piece of the story to tell. The ending of it. Not the philosophical ending, not the part about what came after. The literal ending. The last night of Kael Doreth. The last temple and the last believer, and the moment in which 10,000 years of human relationship with a divine presence came to its close, in a small dark room with a single candle. That part, I had been saving. But before I could get to it, the room needed a moment to breathe. I was aware of that. I had been speaking for a long time, and the delegates around the table had been listening in the specific way that people listen when a story has gotten inside them. Not processing information from the outside, but absorbing it, feeling it settle into the places where their own understanding of the world lived. That kind of listening is tiring. It takes more from a person than passive attention, and I had been asking all 41 of them to do it for hours. So I paused. I picked up my water glass and finished what was in it, and I looked out at the blue dwarf star for a moment, and I let the room exist in its own quiet for a little while. Orel was the first to speak, and she did not ask a question. She made a statement, in the careful, precise way of the Mireni who rarely spoke without being certain of their words first. What you are describing, she said, is not simply a philosophical development. It is the story of a civilization learning to hold itself accountable in the absence of divine structure. The development of conscience as a civic institution rather than a religious one. Yes, I said. That is a very precise way to put it. It is also, she said, a description of how the Mareni nearly collapsed 600 years ago, when one of our twin war gods was lost in a disaster that I will not recount here, but which you can find in the public record. We had half a system. For 30 years we had half a system. And we used it badly. And we came very close to a kind of conflict that our other god alone could not prevent. She paused. We rebuilt the system. We did not try to govern ourselves. We rebuilt the divine structure instead. And it worked, I said. Not a challenge, an acknowledgement. It worked, she agreed. We are here, 200 years of peace within our sphere. She looked at me. But I understand, listening to you, that the reason it worked is that we never lost the belief that the structure was possible. We never reached the point your people reached, where the gap between what the god demanded and what survival required became too wide to bridge. She was quiet for a moment. I do not know what we would have done if we had reached that point. You would have made a decision, I said. Whatever it would have been yours. She nodded slowly. That was not comfort, exactly. It was something more honest than comfort, which is perhaps the same thing in different clothing. Lena spoke next, and her bioluminescence had settled into a pattern that her translator had been describing throughout the session as thoughtful or reflective. A quiet, steady pulse of light across her skin, neither alarmed nor calm, but somewhere deliberate between the two. I have a question, she said, that is perhaps less about the history and more about the present. She looked at me directly. You said your people have maintained galactic peace for 200 years. 200 years is not a long time by the scale of what you have been describing. You spoke of gods lasting thousands of years, of wars lasting centuries. 200 years is recent. How do you... She paused, searching for the word. How do you sustain it, without the structure that a deity provides, without the certainty that comes from knowing there is a power above the human level that prohibits certain actions? It was a better question than it might have appeared. The easy answer was the institutional one, the treaties, the international bodies, the mechanisms of accountability that humanity had built and rebuilt and refined over centuries of getting them wrong. All of that was true, and all of it mattered, but it was not the full answer. With difficulty, I said, and with memory. I set down my glass. The 200 years of peace that we currently hold is not maintained by optimism. It is maintained by the specific and detailed memory of what the alternative cost us. Every major human governmental body on Earth, and in the settlements maintains, as a part of its permanent institutional record, a detailed accounting of every large-scale conflict humanity has engaged in, and what it cost in human lives. Not in the abstract, in names and numbers, in documented individual losses, in the precise calculation of what was destroyed and what was built in its place, and how long the rebuilding took. We do not memorialize war as noble. We memorialize it as expensive. That is a form of religion, Suthan said softly. He had picked up his recording crystal again, I noticed, sometime in the last several minutes. It might be, I said. I have never thought of it that way, but I am not prepared to argue against it. If a religion is a shared system of belief that shapes how a community makes its most important decisions, then what humanity has built around the memory of our conflicts might qualify. I paused. We call it history, but we treat it the way other species treat sacred texts. We teach it to every child. We return to it when we are at risk of forgetting what it says. We hold each other accountable to it. And it holds? Asked Lena. For now, I said. We are 200 years in. The Velkari, I believe, have maintained peace within their sphere for 800 years. The Mareni for 400 since their reconstruction. I looked at Suthan. We are not the galaxy's best record. We are a young civilization by these standards, and 200 years is not enough time to be certain that the pattern holds. But we are here. We are present at every peace table. We are paying attention. I met her eyes. Sustained attention, in the absence of divine certainty, is the only substitute we have found. It is not elegant, but it is real. The hall was quiet again after that, and this time the quiet felt different from the earlier silences. Not the silence of shock or uncertainty, but something more like the silence of a room full of people all engaged in the same private calculation, running the same variables through frameworks built from very different materials. Quelharith had not spoken since his question about deterrence, but he had been watching me the way you watch something you are trying to understand fully before you commit to an opinion of it. His amber eyes moved between my face and the empty space on the registry wall behind me, where Cale Dorith's name was not. He had the look, I thought, of a man who was doing arithmetic that he had been avoiding for a very long time. The Velkari delegate to my left, a young being named Silvera, who had been largely silent throughout the session, attending in an observational capacity for the first time, and clearly absorbing more than she had expected to, leaned toward Suthan and said something quietly. His translator caught it. She is saying that this changes how she understands the human voting record on the Peace Council. Suthan nodded without looking at her. His eyes were on me. Your people vote for the most stringent peace terms every time, Silvera said, directing the comment to me rather than to Suthan. In every resolution that comes before the Council, where there is a range of positions available, the human delegation consistently votes for the one with the fewest permissible exceptions. The other Council members have debated for years whether this is idealism or strategy. It is neither, I said. It is experience. We know what a permissible exception becomes. We have watched, in our own history, how a carefully worded exception in a peace agreement becomes the doorway through which the next conflict walks. We do not vote for stringent terms because we are naive enough to believe they will always hold. We vote for them because we know what they cost to rebuild if they fall. I paused. That knowledge does not make us saints. It makes us cautious in a very specific and very informed way. Silvera sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "And the deity you lost, Cale Dorith. If he were present in the galaxy now, in some form, if the circumstances that led to his decline had not occurred, and he had survived into the modern period, would you want him back?" It was the question I had not expected, and it was the best question anyone in the room had asked. I thought about it honestly, which meant I did not answer immediately. No, I said finally. Not because he was wrong, not because the mercy he embodied was not real or valuable, but because having him back would mean returning to a world in which the permission of a divine authority was the basis for our decisions about conflict. And we have spent 2,000 years learning to make those decisions ourselves, and while we have made them badly many times, we have also made them in ways that Cale Dorith's laws would not have permitted, and that turned out to be necessary. The open palm is a beautiful image, but an open palm held in place by divine law is different from an open palm chosen by people who understand the alternative. The choice is the thing. We need the choice to be ours. Silvera nodded slowly. She was young, but she was listening carefully, and I thought she would remember this conversation long after the summit was over. All right, I said after a moment. The last piece. He did not die on the field outside Areth Vale. I want to be clear about this, because the myth sometimes gets told that way. The death of Aldrich as the death of the god, the battlefield as the site of both endings. That version is cleaner, more dramatic. It has the appeal of symmetry, but it is not what the older tellings say, and the older tellings are the ones I trust more than the cleaner ones, because the truth of long history is almost always messier than the stories we make of it later. Cale Dorith lasted another 2,000 years after Areth Vale. He did not last well. I told this to the hall, and I told it in the way that this part of the story asks to be told, quietly, without performance, in the voice of someone carrying a weight rather than displaying one. The delegates had been listening for hours. They had moved from their formal postures to something more personal, the way people shift when a story has genuinely taken hold of them. Even Suthan, who had started the session in the precise, correct bearing of an official conducting a formal ceremony, was sitting differently now, leaning slightly to one side, hands loose on the table. The god retreated. That is the word every version of the myth uses. Not driven out, not destroyed, not overcome. He retreated, the way something retreats when it can feel the ground giving way beneath it, and understands that staying in one place will only accelerate the fall. The great temples began to empty first, not physically, not suddenly, but gradually and then completely, the way water drains from a vessel that has developed a slow leak. The worshippers who had come every morning and every evening began to come less often. The morning visits fell away first. Then the evening ones became occasional. The festivals that had marked the sacred calendar began to be observed with less conviction. The ceremonies maintained by habit rather than belief, which is a different thing, and eventually by neither. He moved to smaller places. The large temples became storage facilities, community halls, markets, the kinds of buildings that practical people put to practical use when the original purpose has evaporated. He moved to the old hill shrines that no one had bothered to repurpose because they were too small to be worth the effort, to the carvings on old stones that no one painted over because no one thought about them enough to paint over them, to the prayers of aging soldiers who had learned his laws in their youth and never entirely shook them, not because they believed in the literal reality of the god anymore, but because the patterns of belief laid down early are the last ones to leave, buried deep enough that they outlast the conscious faith that once sustained them. He changed during those 2,000 years. That detail is in the older tellings as well, and I believe it, because it is the detail that makes him comprehensible rather than simply sad. As he diminished, he became less rigid. He began, quietly and without announcement, to loosen some of his 14 laws. He started to distinguish between the letter and the spirit of them, which he had not done before. Before, the law had been the law, absolute and without exception, and that absoluteness had been part of his identity. Now, facing the prospect of becoming nothing, he tried to adapt, tried to become the god that humanity in this newer, harder, more desperate age actually needed, rather than the god he had been built for. But it was too late. And here is the part of the myth that I find most honest about what had actually happened. The humans who might have met him halfway were gone. The generation that might have been able to receive a changed version of Kael Dorith and integrate him into their evolving framework was not the generation that existed when he finally began to try. The civilization that had produced the philosophers and the strategists and the doctrine of deterrence had already gone several generations without him, and in those generations they had built something that functioned without divine permission. They had not rejected him out of anger or disappointment. They had simply, over time, stopped needing him. And a god that no one needs is not rejected. It is made redundant. Redundancy is quieter than rejection and more complete. He understood what was happening. The older stories are very clear on this point, and they are the ones I trust. In his final centuries, Kael Dorith was not angry. He was not vengeful. He did not strike out at the civilization that was leaving him behind, did not attempt to reassert himself through disaster or plague, or the sudden reemergence of the conflicts he had once governed. He watched, and he understood, and the understanding did not make it easier, but it was his. He knew why it had happened. He knew that the humans he watched were not wrong in what they had become. They were simply not the humans he had been built for, and he could not change what he was built for. That too is in the myth. There was one temple left, I said. The hall was completely still. Outside, the blue dwarf burned. The hum of the station's systems was the only sound underneath my voice. A small stone building, I said, very old, in a region that had once been the spiritual center of Kael Dorith's worship in the Western traditions, a place where the largest and most important of his temples had stood for over 1,000 years, drawing worshippers from hundreds of miles in every direction. That temple was long gone. In its place was a city, and in the city were people who had no particular memory of what had stood there before, and no reason to think about it. The stone building at the edge of a farming village 12 miles outside that city was not the original temple, and had never been a significant one. It was small and plain and had been built by a local community 2,000 years ago as a neighborhood shrine, and had never had more than a few dozen regular worshippers at any point in its existence. Now it had one. I looked at the table. Her name was Edith, I said. She was 74 years old. She was the granddaughter of a woman who had learned the prayers of Kael Dorith from her own grandmother, which meant that Edith's connection to the tradition stretched back at least 4 generations, far enough that the chain of inheritance reached a time when those prayers had been living rather than historical. Edith had learned them as a child, not in any formal religious context, but in the informal way that households pass things down, her grandmother teaching her the words and the gestures and the meanings, not because she expected Edith to become a priestess, but because she thought the tradition deserved to continue until someone could decide whether it should. Edith had continued it, not because she was a woman of extraordinary faith, She had not believed in the literal existence of Kael Dorith since she was perhaps 30. Life had shown her enough of its actual texture by then, that divine figures had become metaphorical for her, rather than concrete. She continued it because she was a woman who finished things, who kept the commitments she had made, even after the reason for them had shifted, who did not walk away from an obligation simply because the obligation had become inconvenient, or because no one was checking whether she fulfilled it. She came to the temple on the last evening of the last year of Kael Dorith's existence. She came because she had been coming for 60 years and she intended to come until one of them stopped. She brought a candle, as she always did. She lit it at the old stone altar, which was worn smooth by generations of hands placing offerings that no one placed anymore. She sat down on the stone floor, not on the bench. She had always sat on the floor. It was a habit from her grandmother's teaching. And she looked at the old carved image of the god set into the wall above the altar. I paused. He appeared, I said. Barely. A shape in the air, not the tall burning figure of the old stories, not the spear that remembers or the just flame. Nothing like any of the forms that had inspired 10,000 years of art and prayer and ceremony. He was smoke. He was the memory of a shape, rather than the shape itself. But he was there, because Edith was there, and she was the last person on Earth who still came to his space with intention. The room was silent, in a way that had weight to it. He asked her why she had come, I said. He knew she did not believe in him in the way that had once sustained him. He knew the world had moved past him. He asked her, directly, in whatever form communication between a dying god and a mortal woman takes, why she was still there. No one in the hall moved. She said, I am saying goodbye. The silence held those 4 words for a long time. He understood, I said. That is the part of this myth that I think matters more than anything else in it. Not the death of Aldrich, not the 14 laws, not the long centuries of fading. This moment, he understood what she meant. She was not there to worship him, or to argue with him, or to beg him to change, or to rage at the injustice of what had happened. She was there because she was the last living thread connecting the world that had needed him to the world that did not. And she had decided, not as a religious act but as a human one, that something which had been part of her people's inner life for 10,000 years deserved to have someone present when it ended. She was bearing witness, said Lena softly. Yes, I said. She was bearing witness. She stayed until the candle burned out. Then she stood up from the floor, slowly, because she was 74, and stone floors are hard, and she walked to the doorway. She paused there, with her hand on the frame, and what she said in that moment, in the last version of the myth recorded before the tradition that carried this story went entirely silent, was a single word. What word? Asked Suthon. Rest, I said. She said rest. Then she walked out into the evening. The candle was out, the temple was dark, and Kael Dorith, the god who had carried fire in one hand and mercy in the other, for the whole of humanity's first serious attempt at understanding itself, was no longer anywhere in the world. I sat back. The hall held this for a long time. The myth does not call it a killing, I said finally. The myth calls it a release. Whether it was one or the other depends on what you believe Kael Dorith would have chosen, if choice had been fully available to him. Whether the nature he was built with would have allowed him to choose anything other than what happened, or whether his presence in that room, on that last evening, was itself a form of consent. I do not know the answer to that. No human does. What I know is that Edith walked home that evening in the ordinary way she had walked home from the temple for 60 years, and she had supper, and she slept, and she woke the next morning to the same life she had always had, and she lived it for 12 more years before dying at the end of a long summer in her own bed, surrounded by the family she had raised. She was, by any ordinary measure, an entirely unremarkable person. She grew very good vegetables in her later years. Lena made a sound that her translator rendered as quiet grief. Do your people grieve him? Asked Quelhareth. The question deserved the full weight of consideration I gave it before answering. In the way you grieve something you outgrew, when outgrowing it was necessary, I said. Not with guilt, not with the clean mourning of a loss that had no purpose, with something more complicated, with the understanding that what was lost was real and valuable, and that losing it still cost something, even though the alternative was worse. I looked at my hands. We did not become better by losing him. We became more responsible for ourselves. Those are related things, but they are not the same thing, and I think it would be dishonest to pretend the distinction does not matter. Aurel was watching me with an expression of careful attention. And the wars that came after him, she said, the ones you described, the large and catastrophic ones. Does your species hold itself responsible for those? Completely, I said. That is the bargain. When there is no God to sanction or prohibit, the responsibility sits with the people making the choices. When we failed, and we failed badly, at several points in our history, in ways I am not going to minimize, the failure was ours. We could not appeal to divine authority. We could not say the deity permitted it, or the deity required it. We did it, and the history records that we did it, and every generation since has had to reckon with that record honestly. I paused. It is, in some ways, the harder arrangement. It is also the honest one. The room was quiet for a moment. Suthan spoke then, and his voice had the quality of someone completing a thought they had been working on for a long time. You came here to contribute to the Pantheon Registry, he said, to submit humanity's mythology for the cultural record, and you have given us. He paused. Something different from what any other delegate has given us. I gave you the truth of it, I said, which is that human mythology, as it pertains to war, is not the story of a god who governed us and still does. It is the story of a god who governed us, who was genuinely good at certain things, who failed at one essential thing, and who was released, or removed, depending on which word you find more honest, by a species that decided it needed to govern itself. I looked at him. I thought you deserved that version rather than a tidier one. Yes, he said quietly. I believe we did. He picked up his recording crystal. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at the wall of carved names and found the space where one name was not, and I watched his face as he understood that it would remain not there. Not because the human representative had forgotten to register it, but because it belonged in a category the registry did not yet have. Former deities, I said, remembering what I had offered earlier. He nodded slowly. I will create the category. I thanked him. And then I did the thing I had been building toward since the moment I first noticed Quelhareth's expression in the early hours of the session. The particular quality of attention he had brought to everything I said, the way it was not academic but personal, the weight of 600 years sitting behind his amber eyes every time he looked at me. I caught his eye. I nodded toward the door. He understood immediately. He excused himself quietly, and I did the same a few minutes later, and we met in the corridor outside the hall, where the station's ambient light was the cool blue of the exterior star, filtered through 3 layers of treated material, soft and cold and very clear. He was already waiting when I arrived. He was standing with his hands folded in front of him, and his eyes on the wall, which was plain here, no carved names, just smooth material. And he looked at me when I came through the door with the expression of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and is about to ask, with great care, whether there is somewhere to set it down. He told me about the war. He told me things that were not in any diplomatic briefing I had received, things that were not in the public record of the Chorathi's external relations, things that were in the private knowing of a very old man who had watched his civilization lose people for 600 years in a sacred, managed, ritually bounded conflict that served the pattern of the deity rather than the needs of the living. He told me about the deity, a being called Rath Sovek, the balanced scale, who required that no engagement be permitted to tip the war decisively in either direction, who appeared when a battle was going too cleanly and disrupted the outcome to restore balance, who had been present, reliably and consistently, for 600 years, ensuring that the conflict continued. He is not cruel, Quelhareth said. I want to say that. He is not what your people would call a malicious god. He believes, genuinely, that the balance is sacred, that the conflict serves a purpose in his framework that transcends the individual losses. He is not wrong, by his own values. He is simply, he paused. Unmovable, I said. Yes. And your people cannot simply stop worshipping him. The faith is woven into everything, he said. Not just the military structure, the culture, the way children are taught to understand the world, the stories, The language itself has concepts that come directly from the theology of Rothsovek. You cannot remove a god from a civilization without removing something from the civilization itself. And what is removed is not always something the civilization can afford to lose. He looked at me steadily. You managed it. Over 2,000 years, I said. Not quickly, not cleanly. And we lost things in the process that we genuinely mourn. But you survived. We survived, I confirmed. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, I am not asking you to do what your people did. I am not asking you to help us remove Rothsovek. I am asking whether there is a way to, he thought carefully, to negotiate with an unmovable thing, whether your experience of managing the space between what a deity requires and what survival requires, whether that knowledge is something that could be shared. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, submit a formal request through the Chorathi Diplomatic Liaison to Earth Command. Reference this conversation. Request a consultation under the Galactic Peace Facilitation Charter. I paused. I will support the request. I will write the initial briefing document personally. Something changed in his face. Not relief. Relief would have been too simple for what I saw. Something more complicated and more honest than that. Why? He asked. Because we know what this looks like, I said. We have been where you are. Not identically. The specifics are different. But the essential situation. A conflict that serves a structure more than it serves the people in it. The question of how to end something that was made too sacred to end, without losing the civilization's sense of itself. I looked at the plain wall of the corridor. We made it through that. Some of what we learned might be useful. And if it is not, he said, if our situation is different enough that your experience does not translate, then we will have spent time talking honestly about a serious problem, I said, which is never wasted. He nodded slowly. We stood in the corridor for a few minutes longer without speaking. The station hummed around us. The star outside gave its cold blue light to the corridor through the small window at the far end. Eventually we went back to our separate quarters, and the hall emptied for the night, and Orison 7 continued its long, slow orbit at the edge of the star that did not care about any of it. I sat at the desk in my quarters for a long time before I began to write. I thought about Cale Dorith. Not about his end, not about Edith and the candle, but about his beginning. About what it had meant for humanity to build something like him, to look at the worst of what we were capable of, and try to put a divine face on it, try to give it laws and mercy, and an open palm. It had been a genuinely good thing to attempt. I believed that. The attempt had been honest and the God had been, in his way, real, not in the literal sense perhaps, but in the sense that matters, which is the sense in which a thing shapes how people think, and what they choose, and who they become. He had been real in that sense for thousands of years. I thought about Aldrich in the field. I thought about the 3 days of debate, and the decision made on the 4th day, and the 40,000 people who were alive because of it. I thought about the soldiers who had watched their general die in the moment of his greatest success, and had looked at each other and made, over the years that followed, the decision that that could never be the answer. That the lives had to matter more than the laws, even holy laws, even laws that had served for centuries. I thought about the long 2,000 years of retreat and adaptation, and the philosophers and the strategists, and the cold, practical doctrine of deterrence, and the international treaties hammered out by people who had survived the absence of divine governance and learned, the hard way and repeatedly, what that absence required of them. And I thought about Edith, sitting on her stone floor in the dark with her candle burning down, keeping a promise she had made to a tradition that had made her, saying goodbye to something that deserved to be said goodbye to, rather than simply forgotten. Then I opened my report and I wrote. I described the summit. I described the question. I described the hours of conversation, and the 41 species listening, and the things I had said, and the things I had not yet said, and the things that would require follow-up. I described Quell Harith and his 600 years and his careful, private question in the corridor. And then I wrote. They asked why we do not have a deity of war. I told them the truth. They looked at us differently after, not with fear, exactly, with the specific kind of attention that forms when you have been in a room for a long time and you suddenly understand that the most capable presence in it has been quiet on purpose, not because it lacked anything to say, but because it was deciding what to share, and with whom, and when. We are 200 years into the longest continuous peaceful period in our recorded history. Not because someone required us to be peaceful, not because a deity told us to be, because we chose it, with full knowledge of what we are choosing against. The galaxy should understand what the word chose means in that sentence. We are choosing to be peaceful. The galaxy should sit with what that implies. I saved the report. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the ceiling of my small quarters and listened to the station hum its steady note around me. Outside, the blue dwarf burned in its ancient, indifferent way, the way stars burn, completely, without awareness of the small dramas of the beings who had chosen to orbit it, the beings with their gods and their wars and their questions, and their long, complicated, ongoing attempt to build something that lasted. We were choosing to be peaceful. For now. I closed my eyes, and the star burned on, and the galaxy turned quietly around us, and somewhere in it, in a room 12 miles outside a city that had long since forgotten what used to stand on its ground, there was a small stone building with a worn altar and a floor that had known the weight of one woman's knees for 60 years. Empty now. At rest. As we had asked.